So thank you, Maggie, for the introduction, and also thank you for inviting me to give this talk. Many of you probably don't know what bud banks are, but they're my favorite thing to talk about. So anytime someone's like, Sam, do you want to come talk about bud banks? Obviously, my answer is yes. And so it's a pretty small group today. And so if folks have questions, like feel free to, raise your hand or put something in the chat, and it can be a little more conversational, especially since there's only a handful of us, but there'll also be time for questions at the end. And so, like Maggie said, I'm going to be talking about bud banking today. And sort of towards the end of my talk, we'll get about its potential role in restoration, since that's something a lot of people, especially here in Colorado, are passionate and interested in. And so, let me just make sure things are moving along. And like Maggie said, I'm a PhD candidate here at the University of Colorado in Boulder. I'm a third year grad student. And I am very, very, very Midwestern. And so thank you for including that little bit of information. This photo in my background is tall grass prairie from the Midwest, and that's sort of the source of my passion for grassland restoration and grasslands broadly. Um, but I just want to take a moment here to maybe introduce myself a little more. So this is a photo of me from last week when I was at the University of Wyoming giving a very different talk. But just thought, there's some, it's a pronghorn in the back, but you can't actually see it. But anyways, I just also want to acknowledge that I'm a queer scientist, and so I'm really appreciative of spaces being inclusive to queer researchers and the work that we do. So I think it's sort of just important to acknowledge the diversity of people that are doing this science. So this is the map of the United States, and I just want to acknowledge that I was born and raised in the traditional territories of the Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Potawatomi, Dakota, and Ojibwe nations in the Midwest. And as you'll probably hear from certain words I say, I do have a strong Wisconsin accent occasionally. Um, but I now live and work in sunny Colorado, which are the traditional territories of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, Apache, Comanche, Kiowa, Lakota, Pueblo, and Shoshone nations. And like I said, and Maggie said, I am located here in Boulder. And so just a quick outline of what this talk will include. I'm going to give a quick introduction to grassland ecology pretty broadly, focusing on sort of a global scale. I'll sort of transition to a conversation around disturbance ecology, which is super important for grasslands and their integrity. I'll finally get to introducing the bud bank and what it even is, since I think some folks have already acknowledged that they're not familiar with it, which is weird that you don't spend all of your time thinking about bud banks like I do. I'll talk about them in the context of grasslands, and then finally I'll sort of end on this note, thinking about bud banks and ecological restoration. And so because I'm a huge fan of an interactive talk, and there's only a couple of people, maybe we can put things in the chat, but I'm going to flash up some photos of grasslands that I've taken, and I want people to take a gander about, or take a guess at where they might be from. So here's the first photo. I don't know if people want to put it in the chat, or you can just sit with yourself and think about it, but I think it's fun to try and guess where different grasslands are, and I do this to sort of attest to the diversity of landscapes that grasslands can occur in. I don't see anything coming through in the chat, so maybe I'll keep things moving. But this photo here is from a grassland in Western Norway, which is composed, pretty dominantly of pretty wet or moist meadows because it's a high precipitation environment. This is a photo of a tall grass prairie remnant in Wisconsin. Maybe folks are familiar with a view like this. This is a mixed grass prairie here along the Front Range, just south of Boulder. This is a photo of the Great Basin in Nevada. This is a hay meadow in Central Europe. Another photo from Wisconsin because I'm partial. And then another photo from the Boulder area as well, because this is my new home. And so I just include all these to sort of show, one, pretty pictures. And I figured that this is a talk for the Colorado Native Plant Society, so people would be appreciative of pretty plant photos, but also just to show the diverse ways that grasslands can manifest. And so grasslands occur across the globe. This is a pretty crude map just showing general biome distributions across the globe, and you can see in sort of the orangey-ish color where we find grasslands. And so obviously we have extensive grasslands here in the United States throughout the Great Plains. There's grasslands in South America, large grasslands across Central Eurasia, which is the Eurasian steppe. And there's also savannas. And I want to point out that savannas different than grasslands because they do have some tree cover, but still do have a grass-dominated understory. So I sort of lump savannas and grasslands together um, as my main system of interest. And so you can see from this that they do occur um, across every continent. And so what this graph shows you is where we might expect to find these different biomes. And so obviously I'll be thinking about grasslands and related systems. And on the x-axis, we have the average annual temperature. And then on the y-axis, we have the annual precipitation. And so this is sort of looking at which temperatures and at which precipitations do we find which types of biomes. Maybe some of you have seen this type of photo before. Included, I feel like, in every intro biology college course I've either been in or taught. And so what we see is that we actually have a pretty broad range of conditions that can support grasslands or grass dominated systems. And so we have temperate grasslands and cold deserts, which occur across a wide range of temperatures and at lower precipitations. But we also get into this tropical seasonal forest or savanna system. And so this is quite a large area where we can find these grass dominated systems. And then of course, woodlands and shrublands can also have a large presence of grasses and grassland species. And so grasslands occur sort of across the world and in many different climatic areas. Obviously, they tend to grow places where there's less precipitation. The tropics, because there's so much precipitation, tend to be dominated by trees, but we do find tropical grasslands as well. And so grasslands occur all over the place. And a lot of work in ecology and plant ecology specifically has thought about why do we have these grass dominated systems, especially in places where trees can grow. And so you might think about something like Northern Africa, where it's grassland dominated, but there's been these pushes to increase forestation, increase forests, because we're sort of losing trees globally. And so people have actually been putting trees where they maybe don't belong in these grasslands. And it's because grasslands are reliant on two different forms of disturbance to keep them grass dominated and free of trees. And so people probably have some inclinations about what those forms of disturbance might be. One of the biggest ones in grasslands is fire. And so obviously fire is critical for maintaining the structural and compositional integrity of grasslands. I acknowledge that fire is a bit of a touchy subject depending on the systems you're in. And so in the Midwest, fire has almost entirely been excluded from our grass dominated systems, though it's been reintroduced as a management tool. But somewhere like Boulder, Colorado, where it is also used as a management tool, fire can be something that people are really worried about or cognizant of because of things like the Marshall Fire, where just the right conditions will lead to these large grassland fires that can lead to a lot of damage in sort of these wildland urban interphases. And so grassland fires are a natural occurrence and have sort of occurred since grasslands formed, I think 20 million years ago. But nowadays, a lot of fire is used as a management tool. And so like I just mentioned, particularly in more mesic or wetter grasslands, where escape is less of a concern, prescribed burning is used as a tool to sort of increase the diversity and structural complexity of grasslands. But I also want to acknowledge that fire has strong roots in indigenous communities. And so both for cultural and land management practices, indigenous communities have been relying on fire since they've been, around, because it's a super critical tool for keeping landscapes open and reducing woody cover, which then facilitates wildlife and other food sources such as certain plants. But on top of fire is a critical disturbance that keeps grasslands open. We have the other sort of contender in the conversation, and that would be ungulates. And so large grazing herbivores are also critical for maintaining the structural and compositional integrity of grassland systems. And I do feel like when I frequently mention large herbivores, people think of the African savanna because it's one of the sites in the world where we still have these mega herds of ungulates and herbivores that we no longer have in North America. But I also want to acknowledge that we do still have some large herbivores and ungulates in North America, namely the bison. And so, especially in the last couple of decades, there's been a lot of effort in sort of this push to get bison herds reestablished on the landscape, both mostly for the sort of purpose and role they serve to sort of keep these grass systems grassy, free of trees, and they also provide lots of other sort of disturbances that are important for these systems. And then finally, because it's the United States, and we've lost a lot of our large ungulates and herbivores, but we have replaced them. And so now the dominant herbivore in these grass-dominated systems are cattle, which are also critical for the livelihood of many Americans. And so it's important to consider their role in these systems as well. And so both fire and grazing are sort of the two dominant drivers of disturbance in grass-dominated systems. And it's because of these two drivers and their sort of unique effect on grassland systems that we have sort of these theoretical frameworks that we can think about grassland plants within. And so this is a paper out of the subtropical grasslands in South Africa looking at plant life history strategies shaped by fire and herbivory. And so plant life history strategies are essentially just the life cycles and traits that plants you sort of rely on in order to withstand being a grassland species. And so if you're a grassland plant, you have to put up with either being burned or potentially eaten. And there's a bunch of sort of a wide suite of strategies that plants can employ to sort of withstand those disturbance events. And it sort of led to this selective pressure on grassland species to have diverse, but also unique growth strategies compared to plants that say grow in a forest understory where they're not exposed to fire on a regular basis. And I actually just had a grant from Boulder Open Space and Mountain Parks come through this last week, where we'll be testing this framework in Boulder grasslands to look at whether or not we find species along the Front Range of Colorado reflect this sort of fire versus herbivory adapted trade-off. So maybe next year I'll have more data to actually share about this theory. And then the one other form of disturbance, and I'll put that in air quotes, that I want to touch on is something we're all currently making our way out of, I think maybe, which is winter. And so in the temperate regions of the world, which includes a lot of the North American grasslands, but also wide areas of the Eurasian steppe, winter is an important sort of form of disturbance where, because of cold temperatures and snow, plants also have to be able to pull themselves below ground to withstand that dormant season. And so being a grassland plant is pretty challenging because you're faced with fire and grazing during the growing season, and then you're faced with freezing temperatures during the winter. And you have to be able to withstand all of that to sort of maintain these intact and diverse grassland systems. And so the reason that plants and grasslands are able to do this is because they obviously are perenniating and they hold their most of their biomass and below ground organs underground, and then they re-sprout from those each year. And so, contrary to a forest where most of the interesting things that we see happen above ground, grasslands you can sort of think of as an inverse of that, where most of the interesting things happening are actually occurring below ground, which is unfortunate because we can't see it, which also means that research on below ground aspects of grasslands lags significantly behind what we know about above ground. And so this is my favorite photo that I feel like I include in almost every talk I give about grasslands, and it just sort of attests to the diversity of below ground structures that grassland plants employ. And so you can look at the grass systems of the root systems of some of these grasses, which are really fibrous and pretty dense, versus some of these forbs that have really deep, but relatively few roots. And so I've actually tried digging up a compass plant before, and it is impossible. And so it's sort of, as you can see here, obviously there's interesting things happening above ground, but there's a lot of interesting dynamics below ground in these grassland systems. And I also think it's always worth pointing out how hilarious it is that Kentucky bluegrass, Poa pratensis, is also included on here, and it has just the saddest of root systems. And so these systems that are dominated by something like Kentucky bluegrass actually do not have sort of that below ground complexity that we think of when we think of a typical grassland. And so I'm going to provide a snapshot of a couple of different types of these below ground structures. And you might be thinking, Sam, I thought we were going to be talking about buds. All of this is sort of leading to the relevance of buds, and it's sort of necessary to understand the diverse below ground structures in grasslands in order to understand the relevance of buds. So I swear I will get to them eventually. And so from that image I showed you before, we could see that grassland species rely on a large diversity of below ground structures. And a lot of times when people think of below ground structures on plants, they think of roots. And obviously roots are a really important and critical aspect of below ground plant ecology, but there's a lot of other sort of structures that also play an important role in these systems. And so here I have an example of one of those types of structures. And so this is a spiderwort, which is a Tradescantia species. And you'll notice that those roots, they look a little funky. And so these are actually contractile roots. So these aren't roots that are used to absorb nutrients and water from below ground, but they're actually roots that are used by the plant to sort of pull them deeper and deeper into the earth each year of growth. And so grassland plants sort of rely on these types of roots to kind of pull themselves and get nested into the system that they're growing in, which is sort of a newer topic in grassland ecology that a lot of people aren't super familiar with. In contrast to these contractile roots, we also have different types of rhizomes. Rhizome is probably a phrase many people have heard of, and it's just sort of these below ground stems that facilitate clonality in grassland species, but there are a couple of different rhizome structures that plants can develop. And so I'll sort of, provide a little snapshot of each of those. And so this is what we call an epigeogenous rhizome. I feel like it took me many, many months to figure out how to say epigeogenous so smoothly. But these are just similar to contractile roots. They're these below ground structures that actually get pulled deeper and deeper into the earth year after year of growth. And so we're sort of getting at this theme of grassland plants growing really slowly, taking their time, sort of pulling themselves deeper into the earth in order to facilitate that below ground complexity we saw in that earlier image. The other type of dominant rhizome that we find in grasslands, in contrast to the epigeogenous rhizome, is the hypogeogenous rhizome. And these are the rhizomes that people more frequently think of when they think of rhizomes. And so if you think about rhizomes ever, and maybe you never do, I know I do, but they're these below ground stems on grassland species that essentially go out away from the mother plant and will shoot up. And so they sort of form clones across a site. This is really dominant in grassland species, but also can occur in things like trees. And so superclonal tree species like aspens, for example, also rely on some of these below ground structures to sort of form these clonal stands. And then finally, another sort of below ground structure that a lot of people are pretty familiar with is something like a taproot. And so this is, I think it's called like a prairie parsnip or something like that. These are all plants that were dug up in the sandhills of Nebraska last summer. But that below ground structure sort of enables that species to hold sugars and starches and other forms of non-structural carbon in its taproot that it can then use to resprout, say, following grazing or fire or winter. So all these below ground structures are what enable these species to sort of respond following the very diverse ways that life can be hard above ground in a grassland. And I just want to sort of give a shout out to this paper that was looking at the neglected below ground dimension of plant dominance. Obviously, a lot of us look out at a grassland and see all the diversity above ground, both in types of plants, but also timing of things. It's important to acknowledge that similar, if not even more complex dynamics are happening below ground. But like I said before, because it's below ground and we can't see it, our knowledge around that sphere of plant ecology lags significantly. And I just absolutely love this sort of cartoon of all these different structures I was just showing you. And this is from that same paper that was looking at how these below ground organs facilitate overwintering in grassland species. And so we can see those epigeogenous and hypogeogenous rhizomes, but there's also things like tubers and bulbs that people are probably familiar with that also facilitate this sort of below ground complexity we find in grasslands. And so finally, I get to the main topic that we've all been waiting for. What are buds and why are they so important in these grass dominated systems? And so a lot of people are familiar with buds in the context of trees. And so we're not quite there yet, but pretty soon the trees will start forming little buds that'll eventually burst and turn into the leaves that we have throughout the growing season. And for grassland species, they also have those buds. They're just held on these below ground organs I just spent the last 5 to 10 minutes talking about, which is why those below ground organs are so important, is because they're sort of like the branches of trees and they hold all of these buds that will then turn into growth in the growing season. And so I just want to flash this image back up from the beginning of my talk, which is a very zoomed in photo of a grass tiller. And so I don't know if folks can see my mouse, but this, you can see sort of in the center of that little clump of below ground bits from a plant that's a tiller from last year. And so a tiller on grass is just a grass stem. But what you'll maybe notice around it is that there's a bunch of these little sort of triangle shaped guys. And these are all below ground buds. And so these are all buds that have the potential to turn into new stems or new tillers on grasses. So they're similar to buds on trees, but they're held at the base of every grass tiller, and they are what will turn into new tillers each growing season or following disturbance like fire or grazing. And so that's why after we have something like a fire come through a system, grassland species are really rapid to respond. It's because they have these buds on their below ground tissues that enable them to respond super rapidly. And so as you can see, just this one tiller of grass has, I don't know, I think there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and probably more on the other side, buds that will then turn into new tillers. And this is just another photo sort of drawing or illustrating the way that these buds can manifest on different below ground organs. And so here we see something like these different rhizome structures I've been talking about, and these red dots sort of show all the different buds that you might expect based on the different structures below ground that can then turn into above ground shoots. And to ground you a little more, I have some additional photographic evidence of how these buds can look on these below ground structures. And so this image here on the left is similar to that one I was just showing you. But you can see sort of all of these like whitish yellow tissues that are kind of pointy, kind of look like tree buds. And so this grass that I dug up had 3 stems in its previous year of growth, and it has now, I think, roughly around 18 buds that will turn into new tillers. And so I'm sort of starting to get at this fact that these buds are really important because from one tiller in the past season, you could have 5 or 6 buds that'll turn into 5 or 6 stems the next season. So it's these buds that are instrumental for sort of the growth of these grassland species. And then this middle photo here is a tiller, and it's a green tiller, so it's a living tiller of little blue stems, Phyllocardium scoparium. And as you can see on each side of this stem, we have buds that are actually starting to grow out. And so these buds will turn into additional tillers just from this one green tiller that we had in this past growing season. And then this last photo is a example of a switchgrass, so Panicum virgatum. And you can sort of see those little white buds at the base of the plant. And some of them are starting to elongate and grow out to tillers as well. So I just include these images to sort of show the diversity of ways that buds might look like. And these are just 3 grassland grasses. And you'll probably notice that I have a particular disposition for grasses. And so buds can be even more diverse and dynamic on forbs. And I actually, for my dissertation, don't do anything with forbs, but look exclusively at grasses, mainly because they're the dominant driver of biomass and productivity in grasslands. But I also just want to acknowledge that forbs have an extremely wide range of bud banking dynamics as well. And so now I'll sort of place or give us some examples of the importance of bud banks in grassland systems. I also want to acknowledge that maybe you've noticed most of this work isn't mine. I will give a teaser of some of my dissertation work towards the end, but a lot of this is bud banking work that has been conducted by collaborators and colleagues of mine. And so for this figure, we're looking at how annual precipitation affects below ground bud bank dynamics. And so on the on the x-axis, we have the long-term average annual precipitation. This is in millimeters. And then on the y-axis, we have average bud bank. And so I've been using this word bud bank, and I suppose I haven't necessarily taken the time to sort of define that, but just the bud bank is the total number of buds that you have either for an individual or in an area of land. And so this is looking at the number of buds in a square meter, but you can also look at it at the individual level too. And this bud bank is sort of you can think of it as a counterpart to the seed bank. And so maybe some of us are familiar with the seed bank, which is just the number of viable seeds we have in the soil. The bud bank is just the number of viable buds that we have in the soil. And so what these 2 folks were looking at Kansas State, Harmony Dalgleish and John Harnett, was the effect of seasonal precipitation on the size of the bud bank. And so for this, they were sampling grasslands across the Great Plains. And so they went all the way to the tall grass prairie towards the east and to the short grass prairie that we have here in the west. And they sampled across 7 different sites, I believe, or six different sites that sort of occur in each of these grassland types. And so they have a couple sites in Kansas, one in Nebraska, one in Colorado, which is up at the Shortgrass Steppe Long-Term Ecological Research Station by Fort Collins, and then one down in New Mexico too. And so they span quite a range of precipitation. And so they were looking at how this range in precipitation affected the amount of buds that they found in the soil. So as you can see, the amount of precipitation a site has a really large effect on the size of the bud bank it holds below ground, where we have these really wet or mesic prairies, the tallgrass prairie in eastern Kansas has really, really large bud banks. And so we can see these further two sites to the east here can have upwards of 1,200 buds in a square meter. So just think to yourself right now, a square meter, 1,200 buds that could have the potential to turn into above ground shoots. So any stem you see above ground in a grassland came from a below ground bud at some point. And so some of these sites have 1,200 of those buds that can turn into potential stems. And as we decrease precipitation, we see a decrease in the size of this bud bank. So in drier grasslands, we have smaller bud banks, all the way down to the bud banks of New Mexico, where these species tend to not rely on bud banks, and we actually find a lot more annual species in these systems compared to perennials. But in something like tallgrass prairie that's very much perennial dominated, we see really large bud banks. And so it's these buds that enable grasslands to cope with intense variation. And so I was already talking a little bit about all the different types of disturbance that grasslands can experience. So that includes both fire and grazing, but then also thinking about winter. And those three dynamics, less so winter, but for sure fire and grazing can be super variable. And so grazing varies depending on the migration patterns of large ungulates or human management of grazing populations. And then fire is also pretty sporadic. Obviously can be used as a prescribed tool, but could also occur on its own as a natural process. But in addition to thinking about the variation we see in disturbance, we also have a lot of variation in precipitation. And that's sort of one of the defining aspects of grasslands is that they tend to fluctuate quite a bit, both in their temperature and their precipitation, which is interesting. And it's what enables grasslands to persist where they do. It also makes predicting how grasslands will respond to something like climate change really challenging because those patterns are so variable. It can be hard to determine the mechanisms driving community responses to that variation, but it's these bud banks and these buds that we have below ground that enable these species to be so responsive. And so for this, I'm going to jump us a little bit further north and east to think about the prairie potholes region of the Great Plains, which occurs, across Minnesota, the Dakotas, and Montana, and goes up into regions of Canada as well. But this is a region of the Great Plains that also spans the gradient from tall grass to mixed grass to short grass, and its sort of defining attribute is that it tends to be scattered with these potholes, which are ephemeral bodies of water, though most of them have been drained for land management practices. But the prairie pothole region is an extremely variable region of the Great Plains. And so to just show how that variation can manifest in this region, we can see compared to the long-term average, temperature all over the place. Precipitation, also all over the place. And so if you're a grassland species growing in the prairie pothole region, you need to be able to respond to this variation if you want to persist in that landscape. And it's these below ground buds that have the capacity to grow out at different times in response to different triggers that enable these plants to take advantage of good times, but also remain dormant during the bad times. And so the next figure I'm going to show you is at first a little confusing, but I'll walk us through it. Is essentially we can think of a plant. So let's think of a little blue stem. So we have an individual grass. That grass has a bud bank going into year one, which is what this first box shows. Some of those buds that we might find at the base of those tillers, some will die. It's natural to have bud mortality, but some of those buds going into spring will actually grow out into new tillers of grass, which is the green that we see in the spring. And that will contribute to stem density, which drives the annual net primary productivity we see in grasslands. And so it's those buds growing out, becoming stems that facilitates productivity above ground. And those stems that then grow out, because they're photosynthesizing, taking in carbon, generating that sugar, they can build new buds on their bases. So every bud that grows out has the capacity and potential to grow new buds that it'll hold on its bases for future uses. But we also see that some grassland species can hold buds across years. And so say a grass goes into the spring and the spring is atypically dry, which if you were here, not this past spring, but the spring before 2022, we had a really dry spring. And so a grass may choose to hold on to that bud until the next season because it realizes that the environment is not right for it to send out that bud. And this happens every year where these grassland species can sort of determine to what extent they want to send out their buds and when. And that's what enables them to be responsive to those pulses in precipitation versus those droughts. And this definitely varies depending on grassland species. For example, C4 grasses like little bluestem, big bluestem, bootaluas, those species tend to have strong bud dormancy. So they actually have quite high potential to hold buds across years, which is what enables them to be so adapted to the warmer part of the growing season, where something like a C3 grass, like Western wheatgrass or any element species, C3 grasses tend to have pretty continuous bud recruitment, so they don't tend to hold buds across growing seasons, but recruit from them continuously when they have the right conditions. And so there's lots of variation in what grassland species are doing with their buds in order to grow and take advantage of the good times and avoid the bad times. And so just to provide some additional evidence for this and the importance of buds, this is sort of my big wow factor that I'm going to get to about buds here in a moment. But for this study, these folks at, again, Kansas State, a lot of bud banking research has come out of Kansas State because there's a lot of grass. But these folks were looking at the number of new recruits that they find in a grassland site following a burn. And so here, new recruits, you can think of as seeds that germinated and became new individuals. So these aren't above ground stems coming from buds, but above ground stems coming from a new individual germinating and growing that growing season. And they were looking across two different fire regimes. The story is the same across the board, so I'll kind of throw them both up at once. And what you can see is that before a burn, there's some recruits, but there's not many, and that essentially drops off immediately following those burn, the prescribed fire in these systems. And so the main takeaway from this, which you can see sort of as time goes on, we have very few recruits. What this study found was that in populations under any fire regime, greater than 99% of established above ground stems for both grasses and forbs came from below ground buds. Here they say vegetatively produced ramets or tillers. That just means that they're stems that came from below ground buds, and that seedling establishment contributed to less than 1% of all stems. So this is saying that when you look out at a grassland, 99% of what you're seeing came from a below ground bud, and less than 1% came from the germination of a new individual that's contributing to that community. And they also noted that of the 39 species that they looked at, only 14 had visible seedlings. And so sort of this is a huge driving point that grasses and grassland systems are dominated by these bud bank dynamics, and that things like seed recruitment in an intact perennial grassland actually don't matter, which when I tell my seed friends that I hate seeds because they don't matter, they get mad at me. But this sort of, is attesting to that fact that in these systems, buds really drive most of the dynamics we're seeing, not seeds. And so to sort of put this in the context of all these different drivers I've been talking about, the bud bank is super critical because it responds to both grazers and fire frequency. And so those are the two dominant forms of disturbance in these systems, which is what I've been sort of trying to convince you of this whole time. And it's because of this bud bank and its response to grazing and fire and their interaction that determines the stem density and all above ground dynamics that we see in grasslands. And so that could include community composition, but also annual net primary productivity. And those are two really important things in grasslands. What species are there and how many of them are there and how big are they and how productive are they? And all of that is determined by the below ground bud bank. And this just sort of provides an additional piece of evidence supporting why bud banks are important. And this is looking at how grazing intensity affects the stem density of both forbs and grasses and looking at its interaction with fire. And so in this paper, we can see that as you increase grazing intensity in a regularly burned grassland, we get a rapid increase in the number of stems for forbs that we see. And that occurs for grasses too, both in annually burned and less frequently burned sites, where we see as we increase grazing intensity, we actually have an increased density of above ground stems. And that might have some tension in your mind. You might be thinking, Sam, if we're increasing grazing intensity, isn't that going to reduce the above ground stem density because they're getting munched by grazers? And that's true. A lot of the above ground biomass will get destroyed by herbivory from those grazers. But once individuals in grasslands get grazed, it actually releases or sort of breaks the dormancy of the buds that they're holding below ground. And so if one tiller gets munched by a grazer, but that tiller actually had already developed 6 buds, those 6 buds all can now grow out, and it'll lead to increased stem density because of that grazing. So I think a lot of people think, oh, when you graze a system, it might be bad for it, but this sort of proves why grazing at the right intensities can be really important for the integrity of these grassland systems. And it's because those bud banks drive the responses to grazing and fire. And so thinking a little bit more about the context of ecological restoration and why bud banks might matter, hopefully by now I've convinced you that these bud banks are super critical for community and population dynamics in grasslands, but I want to talk about their potential role in restoration as well to sort of close out my talk here. And so bud banks facilitate individual population and community persistence, which if you think about ecological restoration, particularly in grass-dominated systems, our main goal is to increase the recruitment of native species and to keep them around. Because what good is getting native species to recruit if they all just disappear, pretty quickly? And it's because of these below ground bud banks on these individuals that they are able to persist. And so it's important for us in a restoration context to understand how bud banks develop in these newly recruited individuals, but also what are the drivers of those bud bank dynamics, thinking about maybe planning restoration, seed mixes, or management to sort of facilitate that below ground development. And like I've sort of pointed out already, bud banks are super important for responding to environmental variation and disturbance. And so grassland restoration frequently is occurring in disturbed sites or in sites that are experiencing some other sort of stress. It could be drought. And so the bud banks of those restorations could be really important for predicting sort of the long-term resiliency of that restoration. And so now to finally get at some of my own data, because I'm just, a little old grad student, it takes us a while to sort of start accumulating our own evidence. But I was really interested in thinking about how these bud banks develop in perennial grasses early in their life, thinking about maybe we should be selecting species for restoration that develop a lot of buds really early on, because those individuals will maybe be more persistent and resilient to stressful conditions. And then I was also interested in thinking about how variation in environmental conditions might affect those bud bank responses. And so for this work, I seeded a bunch of different perennial grasses, 9 different perennial grasses native to Colorado, and was curious at tracking their bud development across the first couple of years of their life in response to these 2 different environmental conditions. And so for this, species were either seeded on the surface, which is how most restoration is done on the larger scale. Seeds are just drill seeded on the surface. But I was also interested in thinking about what happens when we put these individuals in furrows. And so these furrows are just essentially U-shaped divots in the landscape, about 10 centimeters deep, that actually have significantly higher soil moisture across the growing season. And if you're from Colorado or spent any time here, you're probably familiar with the fact that as you go through the summer, stuff gets pretty dry. And so if you're a newly established grass seedling that was having a great time in the spring when you had precipitation, but now you have to survive the dry season towards the end of summer, it's a tough time. And so soil moisture is one of the most limiting factors that sort of drives the mortality of newly established or emerged grass seedlings. And so these furrows can be used to sort of ameliorate that negative effect of that dry down we see later in the season by sort of increasing soil moisture availability across the growing season. So what I was interested in looking at was whether or not that consistent supply of soil moisture would shift the bud banking dynamics of these juvenile grasses. And so unfortunately, I only have the first year's bud data to look at to see, okay, these grasses have been growing for a year. It was almost exactly a year, March to March. how big are their bud banks, and how does the availability of soil moisture affect that bud bank. And these are just 4 different perennial grasses. They're all C4 grasses. The C3 grasses have a more complicated story, so I'm not going to talk about that here. But I was interested in whether or not we would see a difference for these 4 species. And what we see is that within 1 year of growth, we already see a difference in the size of the bud bank for these 4 different grasses. And across the board, for the most part, we see that grasses growing on the surface, which you can think of as the more stressful, droughty conditions, tended to have larger bud banks. And so it's as if those species, when growing in a riskier or more hostile environment, actually invest more in their buds than they are maybe investing in other sort of outlets for their energy. And one potential explanation for this might be that, as a plant, you have to sort of decide, do you want to flower and produce seed to sort of maybe increase your chances of contributing to the next generation of individuals? Or do you want to invest in your own success and put that energy that you could put towards flowering and seed production towards bud production? And so the one potential explanation that I see here is that these grasses growing on the surface where they have less access to soil moisture are actually choosing to invest in their buds because it's a surefire way to increase your growth in the next year. Whereas producing a seed might be risky because it may not do as well as you could if you took advantage of those resources on your own. And so this is obviously just 1 year of data. And so I'll be digging up individuals across the next couple of years to look at, does this trend continue in year 2, 3, 4, and do things that are growing on the surface continue to invest more in buds than things growing in the furrows that actually have increased resource availability? Ask me in 3 years. And so with that, sort of my main takeaways, particularly in the context of ecological restoration, is we can think about how we can manage systems through diverse seeding approaches. So seeding things on the surface versus seeding things in the furrows. And then the following management actions: when to graze, when to burn, that will increase our success by increasing the bud bank size of native grasses and forbs. So sort of my whole point in this talk is that I think we need to really start, emphasizing the importance of this below ground bud bank as a tool and mechanism that may be driving a lot of the hard to explain dynamics we see above ground in grasslands. But as I've mentioned, bud banks and any below ground structures in these systems tend to be super understudied because they're below ground, so they're hard to get out of the ground. And we just don't have a lot of great language or standardizations of protocols to sort of understand these below ground dynamics. And so with that, I can take any questions. I think, we're at 7:19. So if anyone has any questions about bud banks or any other sort of things they brought up, I'd be happy to discuss those now. And thank you.
Thanks so much, Sam. One question in the chat was, what were the species that performed best?
Yeah, I'm guessing that Beth, I see your question is probably in regards to that figure I showed at the end of just those 4 different grass species. And we actually see the Boutelouas do really well. So they don't always have the largest bud banks. Like Bouteloua critipendula actually has a relatively small bud bank compared to Bouteloua gracilis, but they actually have pretty high success rates, at least in this restoration experiment that we were conducting. I didn't talk about all of the recruitment and survival dynamics, but just sort of was using that to think about bud bank dynamics. But yeah, this is part of a much larger experiment, sort of looking at all these trade-offs in reproduction and survival for these 9 different perennial grasses.
I have a question.
Yeah, totally.
So I'm one of those seed people. So why do you think the seed recruitment is so low? Is that because of the stem density kind of preventing the seeds from getting to where they need to be, or what is that about?
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a mix of things sort of from many different directions. I think like what you just said is a great example that in these super perennial dominated systems, when you're sprouting from a bud, you have way more resources available to you to grow way faster than a seedling, even of the same species, could. And so I think there's definitely some competitive exclusion where established plants and just the lack of space in a grassland keep new seedlings from coming in, which is one of the reasons that things like grazers and fire are super important, because they help open up that space. And so following those types of disturbances, you do have increased levels of recruitment, which is sort of what they saw right after a burn. You do have more recruits, but then they tend to get outcompeted by existing vegetation. But I also just think that, sort of at the point I was making at the end, if you're doing a really good job, why not invest in yourself and your own clonal growth, as opposed to taking the risk of producing seed that, as we know, probably won't turn into a new individual just because competition is so aggressive in these systems. So hopefully that sort of gets to that. Obviously, there's some dynamics there with, like, well, producing seed is really important from a genetic diversity perspective, because these plants will only increase their diversity through sexual reproduction and pollination with other individuals, but it's definitely a riskier choice. That was a great question. Beth, that's a great question about sort of the best guess at successful restoration if removing smooth brome to replace it with a native. So smooth brome is my least favorite grass, I feel like, in this plant on this planet. Which maybe sometime I'll just give a talk about why smooth brome is the worst. But smooth brome is so prevalent and pervasive in our grasslands. Well, one, because it is seeded and continues to get seeded, but because it's really, really prolific at both producing seed and spreading vegetatively. And so to sort of get at that question that was just asked about why are these species doing different things, smooth brome doesn't choose, it does both. And so it has this sort of prolific capacity to spread vegetatively, which is why it just sort of like creates these monoculture fronts that take over grasslands. But then it also produces a ton of seeds that recruit really well, so it's easy for it to sort of generate new islands of invasion. I don't necessarily have a best solution for what to replace it with. One of the species that I think people tend to think about as a good competitor with smooth brome is something like Western wheatgrass, so Pascopyrum smithii. And the reason that they tend to think that is because it's also highly clonal. And so in a grassland, it's the most important thing in a grassland is to take up space. And so the issue with a lot of native species is that they are slow to establish and slow to take up space. And that means that something like smooth brome will come in and take up the space before those natives can. But something like Pascopyrum, which is a relatively fast growing rhizonomous grass, can actually do a decent job at taking up space and sort of out competing brome. It's just sort of dependent on, lots of other things that might be happening in that restoration context. But there's definitely, it is a hard species to think about. I do some work, which I alluded to in the prairie potholes, where smooth brome and Kentucky bluegrass are the dominant grasses in those systems now, because they've just become so pervasive. And so a lot of conversations that we're having with folks up there and land managers up there is, okay, what are we going to do, and when are the best times to sort of target those species and things like that. So it's definitely something that's on a lot of people's minds. But like I said, too, smooth brome is still seeded in some contexts, and so this could definitely be a frustrating species to deal with.
Sam, you might have said this and I might have been talking to my kid, but what about the storage of these buds? Is that complex?
Yeah. So I sort of, showed some of those photos earlier on about sort of the diversity of below ground organs that grassland plants can have. And so that's those different types of rhizomes, those tap roots, those different types of roots. And sort of depending on your below ground organs will determine sort of where you hold your buds and how readily those buds can grow out. And so a lot of long-lived perennial grasses that have those hypogeogenous rhizomes that can spread out and take up room, something like Pascopyrum, to reference the previous question, it holds its buds, right at the tips of those rhizomes. And so those buds are really, able to sort of grow out and take advantage of any space that might pop up. But then there will also be some species, some grasses, but definitely some forbs that will hold their buds for multiple years on, a tuber or on a below ground taproot, and then until like something comes along just right to sort of break their dormancy, they won't grow out. And so there's like quite a bit of diversity in the triggers that buds need in order to grow out. But then there's also a diversity of fuel that those buds might rely on. And so all of those below ground structures I sort of showed everybody also tend to hold non-structural carbohydrates. And so those are starches and sugars that then provide fuel to regrow. Because if you can think of a grass that was totally munched and it has no photosynthetic leaves above ground, how does it grow out its buds if it doesn't have any way to sort of trap energy? And it's because those species tend to pull on those starches and sugars that they were storing in order to fuel that initial growth that will then facilitate photosynthesis, and they'll be able to rebuild those stores that they drew on. So I don't know if that answered your question exactly, Maggie, but it's diverse and complex.
Thank you.
Oh yeah,
Well,
Beth.
it's really interesting, like, because everything has a climate change flare. So my mind is just wondering, if you look at all of the carbohydrates stored in the buds across the Great Plains, I would assume that over multiple years of drought, right, that overall biomass decreases, then that challenges the competition piece of it. But I don't know about the research on competition with smooth brome.
Yeah, totally. That's a great point you just mentioned. And one strategy that folks use to like control something like smooth brome or Kentucky bluegrass, the dynamic duo that they are, is targeted grazing. And so sort of the idea is that if you keep hitting these grasses at just the right time in their growth, usually earlier in the spring, and you hit them hard, you'll exhaust the resources they have available because everything has a limit. And so if you keep grazing them and they have to keep recruiting from buds, eventually they will run out of buds and they will run out of resources. And that's also is what happens when we overgraze natural systems too. It's because of all of this above ground defoliation, the plants lose their capacity and stores to respond to those disturbances. And so it's definitely pretty variable. But your question, Beth, about planting buds instead of seeds is something that comes off quite often. And so the unfortunate bit with buds obviously is that they have to be attached to their parent plant in some way, shape, or form still in order to facilitate that outgrowth, because they're not sort of these freestanding propagules in the same way seeds are. But there has been some work, I think it's been done in the Great Basin, and I think it's had really limited success, where you can sort of grow out these plants and then essentially chop up their rhizomes. And people have used planting rhizomes as a new approach because it's already an established plant, but you can take one grass maybe that you grow in a nursery for restoration, you sort of split it into a bunch of individuals and then plant those with the idea that those will then grow and get bigger themselves. And so there definitely is some capacity, I think, to plant these below ground structures that hold the buds, but I think it's probably not replicable on the scale that you can with seeds, just because you can spread so many seeds over such a wide, range of space. And so I don't think it'll ever be that prolific, but I definitely think that there's some potential. And especially if you're thinking about like small scale restoration practices, so maybe you like restoring your yard or something like that, you could think about planting species that are super clonal and take up a lot of space early on, or have a lot of buds, because they'll probably be more successful than something that doesn't have those traits. But great questions.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, it was, like I said, it's one of my favorite things to talk about. And now you can just, every time you look out at a grassland plant, you can be like, that probably came from buds. And even if you're bored, you can dig up a little bit of a grassland plant and you can dissect the base of that tiller, and you will find these little buds sitting there just biding their time.
I was thinking that would make a great field seminar.
Yeah.
Imagining the picture of people sitting with their noses to the ground looking for the buds.
It is funny. And I always tell people, don't ever start with C3s. C3 grasses or cool season grasses tend to have really small buds that are hard to find. But something like big blue stem, Andropogon gerardii, my favorite plant in the whole world, and also that grows, in some regions of Colorado, has like really big, obvious, nice to see, like I think very picturesque below ground buds. And so that's always the one I'm like, if you want to look for buds, find big blue stem.
Good tip. Well, folks,
I
thanks so
believe,
much for joining us. Oh, yes, Melly, go ahead.
oh, I believe there was one other question in the chat.
I think I got,
The differentiation
oh,
between new recruits and clonals.
yes. Sorry, Becca, I totally missed that. So this is something I've dealt on a large scale, I guess. It's not easy to differentiate between new recruits and tillers that are coming from below ground buds. So what they were doing for that work was they had these long-term established plots out in grasslands, and they would go through, and you can tell when you're on the ground, combing through the grass, a new recruit versus a tiller that's coming from a below ground bud, because new recruits, at least in grassland species, both grasses and forbs, will either have like the coleoptiles, that early leaf in grasses, or the cotyledons, or similar small early stage leaves, versus an established tiller or shoot coming from a below ground bud won't have those sort of early stage leaves. And so that's sort of how you can differentiate between a new recruit versus something coming vegetatively from below ground, which I learned the hard way trying to differentiate this year between new recruits in my experiment versus things that are just reproducing vegetatively now.
Hey, Sam, if you really love the big blue stem, one of my colleagues at K-State is looking at the microbiome of like big blue stem. And they're finding really interesting stuff that I think has a lot of restoration potential, which is that we talk about seed transfer zones, but the
Oh yeah,
microbiomes like are creating a different kind of map, about how you might want to transfer this plant material across the landscape.
totally. Yeah, big blue stem is, I mean, I have this like postdoc idea that's been living in my head for years now that I can't wait to actually execute once I finish my PhD about big blue stem and its role in restoration. But it's interesting because here in Colorado, it's really challenging to get big blue stem into restorations. Like it does not recruit well from seed, and when it does, they tend to die early on, which is super different than in the Midwest, because in Midwestern restorations, like in tall grass prairie systems, if you seed big blue stem into a restoration right away, it'll actually become a problem species because it will dominate so quickly that it'll keep any sort of diversity from coming into that restoration. And that's because when it has access to moisture, it actually does a really great job at spreading vegetatively and producing seeds. So in that system, big blue stem can sort of become similar to smooth brome, where it gets really good at doing both strategies, and that enables it to dominate. So there's sort of like this big blue stem success gradient in restorations across the Great Plains, sort of in response to that variation in moisture. And it probably has interactions with all these other sort of trophic levels and things like microbes and the microbiomes that it's associating with and whatnot. So big blue stem rules the world is the moral of the story.